Hi, this is Paul. While the world goes on talking about its thing, the Little Christian Reformed Church of North America, um, 160,000 of it in the United States and another 40,000 of it in Canada, goes about its thing. And I wrote a piece for CRC Voices this morning, and I decided to place it on my Substack, which I use sometimes. And I entitled it The Return of CRC Lions and the Scattering of Exiled Foxes. Now Nate Hiles has expressed his dissatisfaction with my lion culture and fox culture metaphor. And so on Twitter he says, lion culture and fox culture talk is going to be the thing that breaks me. I can't conceive of a worse dialogue to focus on. Wake me when TLC moves on, which, given my attention span, is probably only a week or two away, but I tend to come back to things every now and then. I talked about it a year and a half ago when I was at ARC, and then now it's sort of rummaging around. That's sort of how things work. And then and then Jess says, what about wolf culture versus badger culture? Taking some things from the great Disney movie Robin Hood. And so that was a lot of fun. That was a lot of fun. But I want to sort of walk through the Substack because, as the video that I released Thursday morning suggested, sometimes there's so many ideas in my head, and then usually, let's say if one gets out the door, then the next day a few others will follow at the door and get applied to some other things, and that's sort of what happened. Those who follow my videos know I've been working on lion culture and fox culture analogy since ARC 2023. These dynamics help us understand the sea change in the Christian Reformed Church in the last 20 years. Here's an AI-generated summary of Pareto's metaphor. Wilfredo Pareto, an Italian sociologist and economist, developed a theory of elite rule that categorizes political leaders into two major types, lions and foxes. And of course, Machiavelli had similar metaphor. You can pick other animals, but these seem to hold some sway. And again, I've been reading a lot of 19th century history lately, and just trying to get a sense of the lionishness and the foxishness, and how these things sort of reverberate through, again, elites that rule. Lions are categorized by use of force and aggression to maintain power. Conservative tendencies, emphasis on unity, homogeneity, and established ways, comfort with centralization, hierarchical bureaucracy, populist and xenophobic tendencies, preferences for simplistic, uncompromising action over negotiation. Foxes are characterized by use of cunning, manipulation, and diplomatic skills, liberal and internationalist tendencies, emphasis on decentralization, plurality, and skepticism, discomfort with use of force, reliance on negotiation and persuasion. Pareto argues that history is a cyclical process of elite circulation, with power alternating between lions and foxes. When one type of elite becomes ineffective or corrupt, it's usually replaced by the other. And I think that that's really important in this metaphor to understand that this is a metaphor, and there's aspects of these things that tend to swing back and forth. When one type of elite becomes ineffective or corrupt, it is replaced by another. This theory suggests that political power is always held by a minority elite, regardless of the apparent form of government. And I think there's a fair amount of truth to that. If you look at late 19th and early 20th century government, you find in Europe, of course, you have the French Revolution, which sort of makes a big swing, but then the governments of Europe push back. And you see a lot of playing around with monarchies in the 19th century. And to what degree is it sort of blended? I finished Katja Hoya's book on Blood and Iron about Germany from unification up until the First World War. And you saw a lot of tensions there. They're sort of feeling their way towards a government in the former Holy Roman Empire. Of course, Napoleon destroys the Holy Roman Empire and gets Germany in its aftermath. And of course, Germany has, a very consequential history then after that. It's important to note that these categories are not mutually exclusive. And individual leaders may exhibit traits of both lions and foxes depending on the context. Pareto's theory continues to be applied to modern political analysis, with some observers drawing parallels between concepts and contemporary political figures and movements. And then I made a link. I'll put the link to my Substack below. You can do with it as you want, but the links are in there. And then I applied it a little bit to the Christian Reformed Church, because a lot of what had happened in the Christian Reformed Church between Synod 2022 and Synod 2024 for the churches and leaders who are now being pushed out or leaving the Christian Reformed Church. At this point, maybe the exodus will be 10%, but it's a really important 10%. A lot of these people had been the leaders in the church for a good long time, and now they haven't just sort of lost leadership. They're being moved out of the church. I often call them the exiles, because many of them are being pushed out, they feel, involuntarily. CRC leadership strategy has been mostly foxile since its takeover by the boomers. A lot of what happens in the counterculture is it's pacifism. A video got released today that was just, it started out so interesting, and then it got considerably less interesting.
This is the year that I'm supposed to reveal to you who I really am. So that's what I'm doing right now. This won't be easy to say, so please bear with me. I'm here to talk to you about the future regarding a very dark matter. I'm actually a time traveler from exactly 500 years in the future, in the year 2525. Now you know where my name comes from. You see, I was tasked with gaining a large social media following so that the message I'm about to tell you right now could gain enough traction to make a difference. And I think I've done that. And how I did it was important to the message itself, so listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you won't seem very likely given current trends, but I can assure you that it happens. 500 years from now, every single person on earth is a Christian. And not just Christians in name only, but Christians who truly follow and value the teachings of Jesus Christ. Because everyone is a Christian, we don't even call ourselves Christians anymore. I never even actually used that word or even heard that word before until I went back in time and learned what it was supposed to mean. In the future, we all just genuinely behave the way Christ instructed, no label necessary. We have no attachments. We don't covet materialistic possessions. We give freely to anyone in need. Letting go of everything makes it so that there's want for nothing.
Just like the Book of Acts.
Everyone simply takes care of each other. We all do our part. Nobody even needs to ask. And the result is that everyone has what they need. Relationships are genuine without seeking advantage. There's no abuse. People aren't even envious.
Imagine there's no
systems of exploitation because the incentive structures aren't even there. It's essentially a paradise on earth. Or I should say that it was a paradise on earth, even though it hasn't technically happened yet. See, when I was 8 years old, in the year 2484, 3 spaceships landed on Earth and made contact with us. We thought they were alien spaceships at first, but some strange human-like people disembarked. And yes, they were clearly human, but their features were unlike anything we had ever seen before. Their skin and hair was different. They had bluish skin and glowing hair. And later we found out that they weren't aliens, but time travelers. And that's how I eventually found my way to you, by using their advanced technology. But I was very much not authorized to do so. I assure you I had a good reason. Our instinct as what you call Christians was to welcome them and treat them as we would want to be treated. So we came bearing gifts. We were good neighbors. And despite being time travelers, the visitors still acted very surprised by our welcoming behavior, and they seemed to admire us for it. And it was no wonder, because the tenets of their religion are in direct harmony with how we lived our lives as the model Christian society. And that seemed...
All right, so I thought, wow, listen to this guy. But then you got far enough, and he's talking about the Dominican Republic. I know that place. I used to live there. And he talks about that everything was perfect and wonderful until dum dum dum. Here they came, and it all got spoiled. But hey, that was, I don't. That's dove culture, maybe. So all right, back to no, not that. Back to this, because this sort of went through the culture and the counterculture, and there's plenty of videos about that. Not by me, but by all kinds of other people about that whole narrative. But hey, points for the imaginative introduction and presentation, until I was deeply disappointed to learn he didn't really believe he's from the future, because I thought wow, it's, I was going to say it's not every day that I meet someone with a story that wild. And that's true. It's not every day, but it's not never. I was just talking to Chemo today, just looking around, and a few things happened. And Chemo's like, "You're not kidding when you talk about the craziness around this place." I says, "No, I'm not kidding at all. Now you know, Chemo, now you know." And just when we were standing there in the parking lot, a Tesla Model 3 came in with a German Shepherd sticking its head out the window, and we just watched and thought, what's this guy gonna do? And well, German Shepherd had to pee, so, and that person wanted to smoke, and they didn't walk too good, so they were out there for a few hours, smoke and a pee, and then they just drove off. I said, man, when the gates open, you never quite know what's gonna. Anyway, CRC's been mostly Fox-like with the boomers, because that's sort of the way you work. Well, what is Fox-like working? Well, I'm very much more Foxy than Liony when it comes to even how I lead. Living Stones, way more Fox-like than live. And in fact, we once had we were renting the church to a guy who pretty charlatanish. And he would, when the church was full of people from Living Stones, he would have people go out and put advertising to his church on all of the cars, which deeply offended. He was a black church pastor, which deeply offended a lot of our people. And I remember one older African American woman saying, and then he would play all these games, and I was just sort of patient with him, and she was like, "This would not happen in a Baptist church." We CRC folks, fairly blue church, fairly foxy. Heavy-handed use of power was discouraged. Soft power encouraged. It was assumed that the arc of history would come with gentle guidance. Synod would acquiesce to the realities on the ground. When we reached a tipping point, Heidelberg Catechism services and preaching would quietly go away. All that wooden shoeness, all that Dutchness, that would all sort of pass away in time as successive generations in America became more and more Americans. We'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. We'd like to give the world a Coke and keep it company. That's the new liturgy. Heidelberg Catechism, it's so stale and wooden and so anti-Catholic, and we're just way more ecumenical. So, and women in church office, that was sort of the, once we pushed women in church office through, then everything would go. Because once it was legal, then women would be all throughout the church in different offices. And that, in fact, has taken place, not to the satisfaction of many. Still, the vast majority of of pastors in senior pastor positions are men. But women are women elders, women deacons, women staff people all throughout the church, to the point that that's probably not getting undone. And in fact, the synodical rules were such that, well, classes could start to seat women, and once 50% of classes seated women, then women could be delegated to synod. And that was at the first synod where women were delegated. And so over the hump, and then the arc of history would take care of the rest. No need. Lion culture, lionish CRC leaders, no longer necessary. Need not apply. That, of course, was the judicial strategy. Now, I'll click on the link there. I've talked about this in many CRC videos. November 13, 2018, All One Body held a meeting at Sherman Street Church. Jim Lucas, former CRC minister, currently works for the United Church of Christ, denomination that already affirms the beliefs and ideas of the LGBTQ plus movement, spoke, and they talked strategy at that meeting. And the panel recognized that the legislative approach of sending an overture to Synod was not likely to turn the CRC into an all-inclusive ally. Now, in 2016, there was a significant synod where the human sexuality report got mandated, and it was mandated in a way that was meant to ensure that all of the participants in that study committee would be affirming of the basic Christian position. That's because a study committee had reported in 2016 that had a majority and a minority report, and a lot of people were hoping that maybe the minority report would just continue to sort of move the Christian Reformed Church along that arc of history towards the affirming position. And the assumption was that young people are all affirming, the more that the old farts die. But then, of course, the Christian Reformed Church wasn't actually working that way. Back to the Substack. That, of course, was the judicial strategy of All One Body. Will and Grace on TV would do its work, university education, Netflix, the gay good daughter of the preacher or the elder, the woman who had been a deacon, always gay but now openly married. The script was set. What we didn't know was the timing, and we didn't know what COVID would be or what COVID would do. Even now, there might be some exiles, that's people who are being sort of pushed out of the Christian Reformed Church, who wonder, maybe did we get the timing wrong? Maybe if Neeland had sort of held off for another 5 or 10 years, wait for after all the COVID trauma and the human sexuality report, then maybe the arc of history would just sort of carry the CRC along. But if you watch my previous CRC videos, you know that no, the CRC was actually getting more and more conservative. And if you were sort of outside of the Grand Rapids bubble and out in further hinterlands, you could watch this happen, because actually the Christian Reformed Church was being successful to a degree in attracting people who were interested in Reformed theology, many of those people interested from a young, restless, and Reformed perspective, many of whom were not for women in office. Some were for, some were against, but they could live with it. If they couldn't live with it, they obviously didn't join the CRC. But the church was getting more conservative. I still think the answer was no. After the death of the circulatory system, the denomination was clearly moving in two different directions. The CRC's future, as with the nation, was more conservative. So I have a link to a blog where I talked about the circulatory system, and Kent Hendricks really wrote it up well, and so there's a link to that on his Substack. Community leaders couldn't save the foxes. So that's the basic narrative in the CRC. And then this morning I read Mary Harrington's Substack, which I found to be a bit murky, but she was quoting a piece in that Substack. So this is the Substack, Britain's Post-Liberal Nation-State Paradox. And she was quoting an article from Why Post-Liberalism Failed, a genealogy and critique of a Marxist heresy. She had a quote in there that really made sense to me, because yesterday one of the things I was sort of working through was some of the Ezra Klein videos that I had been watching. So this is this paragraph that she took from this other piece. As had been noted by others, the state was increasingly unwilling. This basically says that, and a lot of the post-liberals have the narrative wrong. In fact, they have it reversed. As has been noted by others, the state was increasingly unwilling to mediate directly with many of its subjects, and proven reluctance. It was in a video. Yeah, it was in the video about civil war on Louise Perry, where the guy made the observations, and I cited that observations a few videos back, where he said, governments have been moving away from the demos because the demos feels too populist in the minds of many governments in Europe and America. And so through, hopefully, say, controlling what's on Twitter, through controlling social media, the elites decided, now these are the liberal elites, decided to get more lionish. And I think this was when the American demos began to feel uncomfortable with rising lionish behavior from the left. And that's what really begins to trigger Jordan Peterson, really begins to trigger the guys like Eric Weinstein. And of course, COVID with the lockdowns just cemented it in there. That lion culture is coming back on the left and the right, but it's taking different forms. And at least especially in the 20-teens, it gets coded as tyranny. And so that's when you start to get all the IDW stuff, the free speech, all of those things. But it had also been happening in the church. And so increasingly, the CRC leadership was getting more and more lionish. We've got to lead these people out of systemic racism. We've got to lead these people out of their bad climate habits. We've got to lead these people. And so slowly we've got to turn up the heat on the church, and we're going to use the banner, and we're going to use synod, and we're going to use regulation in order to transform the CRC and just kind of increase its pace as it moves down this arc of history. So, as has been noted, the state was increasingly unwilling to mediate directly with many of its subjects and has proven reluctant to directly police a set of ethnic and religious groups without the consent and approval of unelected and self-appointed community leaders. This policing approach was the necessary consequence of the idiom of communities and stakeholders now endemic in public life, and which is informed by the communitarian notions of the big society and the third way. Far from suffering from too much individualism, Britain appeared to be governed by the communitarian dogmas that post-liberals advocated. And so what you tended to hear then from these elites that were sort of getting lionish over on the left, trying to move the arc of history ahead, was we've got to listen to the black community and the LGBTQ plus community and the Hispanic community and the queer community and the indigenous community. And so you have these proliferation of communities. And although these communities are bodies of a sort, usually sort of demographically or racially or constructed in some way or not, they're not obviously political, but they definitely are political in terms of valence. These communities are holding more and more sway. Now, when I read this, suddenly all of the Ezra Klein stuff started to make sense. Part of the strategy of Fox culture is to lean on the community leaders to do the quiet work beneath the waterline so that when it comes to the official change above the waterline, it's already been settled. So, in other words, keep doing the work with the people. Keep, before Synod, you have this, we're going to have this lecture about use of power. And because we struggle to, because of the demographic of the Christian Reformed Church, we struggle to get enough ethnic or gender or representation. So then we're going to have ethnic advisors and we're going to have youth advisors, and for a while had women advisors. And then there was a proposal to have LGBTQ plus advisors. And so these communities just had more and more power within the system, but their power was unofficial, but their power was given sanction by the increasingly lionish people on the left. And that made the demos on the right and in the moderates increasingly nervous, because it's like these people are given power and control, while many of them often just saying power is wrong. But it's like, but you're being given power. But power is wrong, but you're using power because you're using the power that the establishment has in order to move the church in a different direction. And of course, the conservatives, for a very long time, had been making more and more noises. And as I'd been watching synods over the years, it was increasingly clear that the conservatives were growing in power. And when it came to actual votes on the Synod floor, the establishment was losing control. So part of the strategy of Fox culture is to lean on the community leaders to do the quiet work beneath the waterline so that when it comes to the official change above the waterline, it's all been settled. Sure, there will be some Neanderthals who don't know what year it is. It's 2023, for goodness sake. That, 2023 is on the arc of history. And everybody sort of knows this is the way the future is. We all know this is how it's going to go. And in fact, many times I noted the conservatives just had the same assumption as the progressives in terms of, that's why First Ripon, which is a church right down the road, left the denomination, because they held the same assumptions as, in many ways, the progressives. And they just said, well, it's just going to keep going this way, so we might as well leave now. Oh. And I visited them and I said, I'm not so sure you're right on that, because I'm watching and I think actually the Grand Rapids bubble is distorting not only their view of the future, but your view of the future. So those Neanderthals who don't know what year it is, but for the most part, the great arc of history can be trusted to move the demos, that's the people, the demos, towards the eschaton. The Abide project, was naturally seen by the reigning Foxes as retrograde, a vestigial organ-like Christian renewal. And some of you who are old like me will remember back when I was in seminary, Christian Renewal was one of these little independent publications similar to Abide in that there was no ecclesiastical sanction. It was a group of concerned citizens. And so that's when Better Together started using the language of concerned. It was like, whoosh, wow. I remember when Daryl Tard Marinas was rallying around the concerned flag to drum up the confessionalists against women in office, and now Better Together is hitting the concerned button to try to rally the CRC now exiles around that cause. This is really interesting. Christian renewal getting stuffed in the seminary boxes until seminary closed the boxes so you couldn't politic to the seminarians anymore. That fought and lost the women in church office wars, and was imagined that community leaders would of course hold sway. This was part of why synods 2022 to 2024 felt so not CRC to many people. This is not the way we do business. We no longer do church discipline. We no longer lead from synod. We let the community leaders and the arc of history move the church, and then synod comes along and says, oh, of course. Oh, let's codify the changes that our community leaders and our elite lions have established for us. Pre-boomer CRCs knew how to use power and were unafraid of using it. Just read some CRC church history or just go into the anecdotal. CRC councils, CRC classes, CRC synods, they would say yes and no, they would gatekeep, they would just decide, and for the most part, that was the way it worked. Power was official, to a degree. Again, these are tendencies. It was a pro-lion culture in the CRC until the 70s and 80s. The CRC is joining the rest of the world to teach the world to sing. I don't know how foisting sugary carbonated beverages is not capitalism, but that's that whole the rebel cell thing. Who really fears Pastor Bob, who's a quivering mass of availability? He's such a nice guy. He's going to serve communion to anyone who is willing to receive it. Church discipline went away with the lions. Foxes will sit down with a tissue box and sympathize with your feelings for hours. So I'm a very foxy man. Don't clip that, Grizz. Progressive wannabe lions. This post originated on CRC Voices, where on the previous day, I referenced resonances between the CRC and the Ezra Klein conversations about Democrats not learning from 2024. This is on Substack forum. This is on YouTube. The link is in the Substack. Democrats need to face why Trump won by Ezra Klein. I'll go put that right up for me. I thought, oh, that sounds good. That sounds interesting. And I listened to it. I was fascinated by it. And after I'd seen it, I noticed that Dreer covered it pretty fully in his Substack. So super interesting when you get that kind of crossover. But the other Ezra Klein piece that caught my attention is his new book, Roll Out with Derek Thompson of The Atlantic, entitled Abundance. And there's a book review of that. And there was a little video with Barry Weiss, with Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson talking to Barry Weiss. And what was fascinating was I had just been to ARC, and Ezra Klein sounds like, in some ways, he's down with ARC. Ezra Klein is making the argument the liberal foxes just can't seem to build anything. And look at, just do a little research on California high-speed rail. I remember reading stuff about this 10, 15 years ago and talking to some of my friends who worked over in the Capitol, and one person coming up to me and says, it's a work project. And what that means in Blue City America is it doesn't need to get anything done. It's just about giving jobs. And how do the jobs usually line up? Well, according to whatever the political machine says, the kinds of people who should get those jobs should get it. And so this California high-speed rail is just going on and on and on. Ezra Klein comes along and says, why can't we have high-speed rail? Why can't we have green energy? Why can't we have these things? I'm smelling lion. I'm smelling lion from the left. What's happening? And so Barry Weiss puts it right to him, says, wait a minute, you kind of sound like Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen. And he says, well, yeah, but I just want to do it green. All this talk about, Jordan Peterson wearing his pin about fossil fuels and all of that. No, not going there. We just want big mass green projects. And in order to do this, we're going to have to figure out how to do this, because why can't we build apartment buildings in San Francisco? And if you ask that question and you listen to Ezra Klein, he basically says exactly what this quote says. We've got all this NIMBYism, and we have all these environmental controls, and we want to honor communities, and we want to pay attention to the environment, but we need to be a lot more pragmatic, because the way it works now is that, sort of like when Europe decided they were going to go get rid of all those nuclear powers, they turned on the coal generators, and it's like, wait a minute, I thought you were green. And then, of course, the Ukraine war and the natural gas from Russia and oil from, on and on and on and on and on. So Ezra Klein, wants to be a lion. And, maybe if All One Body decided to be more lionish, that wouldn't have worked anyway, because, of course, the denomination was changing. Between Ezra Klein talking to exile Barry Weiss and then Gavin Newsom has these podcasts, and he's got Charlie Kirk and Steve Bannon, he's got people from the other side too, and it's like, what is happening? The lions are returning, and some of these foxes are saying, I can be lionish, I can have big paws, I can roar, because, if there's anything, says Gavin Newsom is getting termed out, and he's like, next up, the big house. And if I'm going to take on the roaring Republicans, I need to be a roaring Democrat. In fact, Democrats for a long time, if you've listened to them, have been complaining, why don't we roar like Republicans? Well, there you go. Now we're all roaring. Because Ezra Klein is asking, can foxes actually get anything done? And a lot of foxes are coming to the conclusion like, maybe not. Maybe we're really good at doing meetings. Maybe we're really good at stopping big projects. Maybe we're really good at being careful. But if you want to do big things, you're probably going to have to be a little less careful and neurotic and a little bit more risky, loud, and be a little less afraid of hurting certain communities' feelings. Because maybe the communities aren't all that anyway. You look at David Chappelle and his Netflix, and he's talking about all of these communities, and he's like, is this for real? Our common parlance around terms like LGBTQ plus community has been useful but a fraying fiction, as many have noted. And T has sort of, you've got the TERFs, and you've just watched that whole thing fragment. These communities, when tested, reliably fell apart, especially as the alphabets got longer. This to me was never more evident than during the George Floyd moment, and people spoke about defunding the police from the black community. And it was like, when peak black community was operating, I'd heard many African-American moms begging for more policing of their neighborhoods. Now, that's a super complex issue, but real leaders and real communities have real complexity, and a lot of the community popularization in the culture was super low resolution, which is why the whole defund the police thing just didn't last very long, because police actually in a high crime neighborhood have a function, and all these wishful ideas about having all of the young men who are on the street sort of be like the police, it's like, that isn't gonna work. They're on the street doing something else. It's capitalism, but with some big negative externalities. So when black community was operating, its complexities were never more obvious because there was actually lionish leaders whose differences were obvious. You had Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. You had lots of sub-communities, and they were lionish, and they had ideas, and it was their movement or your movement. And sometimes they would collaborate and negotiate. Remember, these are tendencies, but sometimes they would stick their ground and dig in, and especially if they figured out maybe we'll win. So don't compromise. And the truth is, politics never stopped that. I live in a political town. Everybody knows politics in Fox country play nicey-nicey, but that's a veneer often above a level of realpolitik. Never went away. Now, moderate foxes watching the lions do some work. A lot of people wonder, well, why did the moderates had always been allied with the progressives in the CRC, and why did they sort of switch allegiance and side with the conservatives in the confessionals? Well, Fox-style CRC leadership believed that the lions had been regulated to the dustbins of history, and no matter how classist Minn Kota tried to roar from its flyover country, they would never have the votes to cause a crisis. But again, I had been watching the votes for years, and it's like, I remember them making the editor of the Banner cough up a tearful apology to save his job. And I thought, it's a little lionish. I didn't have the term then, but it was interesting. And I watched when the usual complaints about the Office of Social Justice sort of get batted down in advisory committees. I remember once when the advisory committee sort of gave it the bat down, and the advisory committee was overturned on the floor of Synod. And Synod demanded a stiffer supervisory regime over the Office of Social Justice, which was subsequently declawed by the administration. And I'm watching this thinking, I think the lions are going to come back. And they did. Lions, however, are seldom as unitary as their imaginations would hope, because people imagine it's the Lion King, and once Simba comes back, all will be well in the kingdom according to how I think the kingdom should run. And it actually doesn't work that way either. There's a reason that lions are often supplanted by foxes, and foxes are supplanted by lions, and they go back and forth. These are movements and modes of operation among elites, calculating what they want, how much they want it, and what they think they can achieve. Lion cultures fight. And so Zach, and we had a pretty amazing, it was like a 5-hour live stream today on, I'll put the, Chad starts with his tile. Let's see, 4.5 hours, Chad starts with his tile. Chad's just talking to Ethan Caughey. That is how to say his name. I got it from him. And they're having a wonderful talk. And Chad is talking about how he and his wife just watched Upstairs, Downstairs, and now they're watching Downton Abbey. He'd never heard of Downton Abbey, and Downton Abbey is awesome. And it's like Upstairs, Downstairs, and Downton Abbey, we all know the kind of people who really liked that and when they liked it. And now we have this Tyler from Wisconsin who's really getting into Downton Abbey. And so I had to jump in and I had to say, I know why you like Downton Abbey. You like Downton Abbey because Downton Abbey is all about the transition from a lion culture to a fox culture, from a culture of hierarchy to a culture of equality, from a culture of coercion and use of social power and pressure to a culture of we'd like to teach the world to sing. It's part of the reason we're fascinated by that transition, because we're in another one of those transitions. And so we're sort of looking at vestiges of Victorian England saying, boy, those buildings sure were pretty, and sure is a shame they all had to kind of divest and rent out their manors and their castles and their mansions because they didn't have any money, because foxes killed that culture. Foxes have power. They just use it in different ways. It's much more arenic, and lion culture is much more agentic. And so then we had some lion culture and fox culture skeptics in the room. And Chad was super helpful in putting in a piece of saying, you got to understand that you got to take all of this with a heavy dose of kayfabe. And you've also got to watch, you also have to watch Michael Sartori's ongoing development of kayfabe. And actually, some of that's going to be in my sermon Sunday, or at least the rough draft. We'll see if it survives the rough draft. You never know. So we just had really a wonderful long conversation. And I clipped some of it. I streamed some of it to my channel. I came in later. Mark S. came in. It was and then Zach from Sweden came in, and Zach's been around a while, but doesn't have that much visibility. And I think after, if any, Chad got a climate change notice from YouTube. My goodness, I wonder if I got one. Must have been later in the video, but yeah, it was a big, it's a big video. It's a big video. So lion cultures fight. And as, again, Zach had noted, there was a long peace before like 1910. And that long peace of Europe was because the lions sort of figured out a way to, well, let's have this one family sort of rule everything. And what if the Kaiser of Germany and the Tsar of Russia and the King of England are all blood relatives? The Habsburgs had worked that for a while. And so that was a very common lion strategy, to make Europe one big happy lion family. And there was lots of the rest of the world to sort of carve up. And so everybody's sort of grabbing colonies and doing that. But Germany and Japan didn't get in on that earlier. And Italy didn't. Of course, then you're setting up the lion wars of the First and Second World War. And then after the war, of course, you get this Foxy Pax Americana, where the American lion wears fox clothing and, tries not to lean too hard on the wounded lions of Europe. The Suez, just pretend that Suez incident never happened. But America is calling the shots. Well, then you really have to look at Mary Harrington's "You Can't Make Me," where basically says, well, the American lion is now sort of pulling back in its den too. Trump is sort of shaking off the fox clothing, but the American lion is like, how long are we going to baby you European foxes? Deal with that Russian. Nate, you really want bear? You really want bear culture? Just thought of that. I don't know if bear is exactly the right one you want. Maybe it is. You've been reading a lot of Russian theologians. Maybe bear culture is the culture you're looking for. In the Christian Reformed Church, we'll now see what comes. Lion and fox dynamics happen for a reason. Too much lioning could fragment the CRC into tiny little clusters that would probably be meaningless. A lot of exiles are saying to the moderates, you have it coming. Those conservatives are going to push you around, and we foxy progressives, we were always nice to you, and we were patient with you, and we just would let the great arc of history move you along slowly towards openness for all of these things. And the conservatives aren't going to be anywhere. Now you've got to sleep with lions instead of foxes. And again, yeah, but the foxes were evolving. They were getting bigger. We don't really know how what denominations mean in the age of the internet and rising metagelicalism. Balkan-sized lion states, perhaps. We don't know. And that's where I think there are a lot bigger questions going on in terms of Christianity than just denominational politics. Because I don't know how the internet changes denominations. There's a lot going on there. And it's too early to tell. But the exiles jumping over to the RCA, no, don't do it. It's not a good move. Be a little lion in Grand Rapids. Work your stuff. Going to the RCA, you're going to... No, I think it's a bad move. Work on, my CRC exile friends have lots of smarts and they're really wonderful people and they've got some strong churches. Work your program. Prove, attract the moderates to your new denomination. Make the CRC great again to the degree that Paul Vanderklay out in Sacramento says to Kevin Adams and Eric Dirksen and Aaliyah Marsden, maybe we should, take a coalition of the willing from Central California and join the open people, even if we're not down with that. But everything that the exiles have been showing us is like, I don't know. We used to back in the circulatory days, we used to look up the hierarchy, and now we've got some real questions like that Reform Journal piece on transfiguration. So we're in a liminal time. Everything's breaking up, and other things are holding sway that we don't really see very well yet. To me, the exiles are in an Ezra Klein moment. And certain, Ezra Klein is playing with arc language and written a book called Abundance. So we're going to see the left get lionish. And I think if the Democrats want to win the White House again in 2028, I think we're probably going to see a much more lionish Democrat who is, and Biden, we saw some of this for a while with Biden, a little more willing to say no to the communities and to say this is the way forward. And maybe not everyone in your community actually is what your so-called community activists pretend. You don't actually have the votes you think you have. Just by pointing to a demographic and say, all of us believe this, so say we all, yuck, yuck, yuck. No. These communities are not really communities. They don't have leaders. They're just these blobbish things that people point to, and because of a series of mass assumptions that are usually seeded by a particular propaganda, everybody assumes that to be black means this, 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 and this, and to be gay means this, 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 and this. And again, if you go back to the Ezra Klein Shore video, he says that what really changed in the Trump election was not white people didn't move. It was the African Americans and especially the Hispanics that moved to Trump MAGA country. So, because people in other places of the world coming in, Latin America knows all about lion culture. Trust me on that. And some really nasty lion cultures. So there's a lot going on. The exiles are in an Ezra Klein moment. Do they want to build? Or do they want to go to the Reformed Church in America to continue Fox culture, where the communities will have sway in making it hard to build apartment buildings in San Francisco? CRC Confessional Conservative Lions are, of course, dreaming big. Not too big. I think from a lot of the Abide people, I think many of them are I think many of the CRC winners, most of what I've heard is that we're not going to refight women in office. We're not going to do that. That would fracture the denomination. And I think they're right. And I think it's also the case that even the new male millennial lions who are sort of in the dominant seats in the Christian Reformed Church and ascending, so they've been raised by foxes. They know all the therapeutic language. And I know that because I remember old lions. Old lions didn't care about your feelings. The new lions, they're willing to be lioness, but with a kinder, gentler way. So it's super interesting to act. So, and I think the foxes are going to really, the moderates are really going to play Foxy. They're going to keep watching. They're going to keep watching. And I'm not saying Synod 2025 is going to resolve anything. One synod is followed by the next. And we shall see. We shall see. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.